That was great. Thanks again for joining us for the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm John Carlin, the chair of Aspen Digital Cybersecurity Program. And the full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. I want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene these conversations in such a complicated year. We'd also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SICPA NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. I'm pleased to introduce the final session for today. We'll be back tomorrow at noon Eastern Standard Time to hear from 2 of the nation's top healthcare chief information security officers to talk about the security of the COVID-19 vaccine development and distribution process, a conversation I know we're all eager to hear in hopes that someday we can escape our living rooms. Now to close today, a great conversation among 2 colleagues, my successor at the Justice Department, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, John Demers, and the first ever Senate-confirmed director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, Bill Evanina. It'll be moderated by Wall Street Journal's Aruna, Viswanatha, and I hope to hear about their views on what the current threat is from China and how many individuals do they think are inside the United States that might be collecting intelligence. And with that, turn it over to Aruna.
Hi, thanks for being with us today. I think, and we're being joined shortly by John Demers and Bill Evanina, who should be on in a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone here.
Great, and I think John is just about to join us.
Yes. Can you hear me, Aruna?
Yes.
Great.
I think we can't see you.
This host had stopped the video. There's Aruna. Can
Great.
you see me now, Aruna?
Yes. Okay, great.
Excellent.
So thanks for joining us today. And just to kick things off, so the Justice Department had announced this China initiative almost 2 years, just about 2 years ago. And that same week, the Justice Department did file a couple of cases alleging trade secrets theft by a couple of Chinese companies and individuals, including a Chinese intelligence officer. And then at that time, John, you said that the cases taken together paint a, quote, grim picture of a country bent on stealing its way up the ladder of economic development and doing so at American expense. And now that, you know, it's been 2 years, there's obviously been a series of additional cases from the Justice Department. The FBI is opening a counterintelligence case every 10 hours or so linking to China. So maybe let's start off by stepping back a little bit and getting your assessment of what has all of this law enforcement activity, what kind of impact has that had? Has that picture you painted 2 years ago changed at all?
Well, thanks very much, Aruna, and obviously thanks to all the folks at Aspen Cyber. I heard Carlin's voice before as well for having me on, for having Bill on, which is the harder pull. But I think, you know, from our perspective, what we have in the past 2-3 years managed to disrupt a significant amount of malign Chinese activity. And I can come back to that. I think we've also managed to raise awareness through our cases in the private sector, in the public, in the university community, all of which goes to helping us disrupt that activity because we really can't do it without their cooperation and their efforts and their stepping forward to help us. And then third, I think it's allowed us to further our cooperation with our international partners and other free market liberal democracies around the world. And I think we're going to need that as we work together to try to figure out what the new relationship should be with China. On the first point, on the disruption point, we talk a lot about our cases, and obviously each one of those cases represent economic espionage, political espionage, or other malign activity that has been disrupted, in that instance, oftentimes with the arrest of the individuals involved, and then later their convictions or their guilty pleas. But I think, what we've also done recently is taking a more programmatic approach. And so if you look at the cases, just as an example, over this past summer, we arrested 5 or 6 researchers who were here from China on visas, who were affiliated with the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, but who hadn't disclosed that affiliation, had hidden that affiliation when they applied for their visas. Those 5 or 6 arrests were just the tip of the iceberg. And honestly, the size of the iceberg is one that I don't know that we or other folks realized how large it was when we began down that road. But between those 5 and 6 arrests, between the dozens of interviews that the Bureau did of other individuals who were here in similar circumstances, and then ultimately the closure of the Houston consulate to disrupt both foreign influence activity and economic espionage activity, more than 1,000 PLA affiliated Chinese researchers left the country. So our prosecutions were just the beginning of that, but they allowed us to message to the Chinese government that if you're going to send individuals here, you've got to do so honestly, and you can't do so hiding their affiliation to the PLA and to Chinese military universities. So that's an example of the disruption, in addition, as I said, to the cases themselves where we've arrested the people and stopped that conduct. But there are other examples of where what we're trying to do in the cases is not just arrest that individual, but disrupt a broader course of activity.
That's I think a new number that I don't think you've put that out there before, that 1,000 military researchers have left the country since those cases.
That is a new number, yes.
Do you view that network as, obviously some of those defendants describe them as sort of administrative crimes. They're not actually being charged with espionage. Do you view them as sort of a network that is involved in collaborating to collect information, or is this more of a sort of process issue where we just need to have a better handle on who is coming into the country?
Well, it's certainly the latter. I mean, we definitely need to have a better handle on who's coming into the country, but there's no question that they were part of a Chinese government effort to send these individuals here and to send them here without disclosing their identities. I mean, what we saw in the reaction to the arrests, based on other investigative work that we did, was that the Chinese government was instructing those individuals to hide their affiliations, both up front on their application form and then later, when they were afraid of having these folks get caught. So there's no question that, this wasn't a series of coincidences or a series of individuals who didn't understand their forms. They were part of something bigger. Again, we haven't charged them with espionage. Our goal here is to disrupt that kind of activity, and you can do that in any number of different ways, and this was one of them.
Bill, to bring you in, you've been in your job for, I think, almost 7 years now, and obviously you've witnessed this shift in the U.S. government's approach. To what extent, what have you seen as the impact of all of these trade secret theft cases, these researcher cases? Is it sort of a game of whack-a-mole a little bit, or have you seen a fundamental change in the landscape?
That's a great question, Aruna. And again, to echo what John said, thanks for the opportunity to be here with Aspen and partnering with my friend John. I think this is a really good opportunity to be able to get this information out to the people who are in this Aspen ecosystem. I think it's really important. But to your question, I think it's multifaceted in terms of the impact. Clearly, the impact that DOJ and the FBI bring with the indictments, for me, has geopolitical impact and it has counterintelligence impact. And what I mean by that is the way the Department of Justice and John's China Initiative have really promulgated the indictments to be reading indictments, to be stories of their own. It really lends itself to US-based companies to read these as a watch out for what not to do, be aware of kind of narrative, unlike, maybe other type of indictments they might do. So if you pick any one of the cases you referenced or any other of the 3 or 4 dozen cases the last couple of years, the indictments by themselves are phenomenal reads for how the process works and what China's strategy is with going ahead and trying to obtain our trade secrets and our proprietary data and our ideas. To John's last point, of those 1,000 or so PLA students, where I'm most concerned about are the graduate level students. And let's not kid ourselves. They're all coming here at the behest of the Chinese government and intelligence services. They're going to specific universities to study specific fields or areas that are going to benefit the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party and the military. So that's the strategy. We need to be aware of that so we can continue to advise and inform heads of academia at the college university level that this is happening and somehow find a way to be constructively mitigation efforts to do that. Secondarily, what I like to do, and I've done successfully with John's indictments and the hard work of the women and men of the Department of Justice and the Bureau, I've taken those indictments overseas. And I'm fortunate to have a really cool role as head of counterintelligence for both NATO and leading the efforts in the Five Eyes to take these indictments overseas to Europe and show our counterparts what's going on here in the US so they can advise and inform their policymakers in Europe of the same techniques and tradecraft we see from China. And that's been a big win, whether it be on theft of intellectual property and trade secrets to 5G, to semiconductors, nanotechnologies. We've really come a long way the last 2 years in Europe of advising and informing our partners in Europe of the nefarious activities of China. And I think that's directly relatable to the way that DOJ now writes their indictments.
That's really interesting. Is there a specific case you would point to that's sort of opened some more doors in Europe or that they've been particularly receptive to?
Yeah, I will. And I know John has heard me brag about this before. Two of them would be the Micron case. I think is something I look at as an indictment that's worthy of already a movie in the making, and as well as the Huawei indictments and the superseding indictments. To me, and I've said this on the circuit that all the CEOs, every CEO and general counsel need to read these 2 indictments because this is the tried and true process, not only from a cyber capability and a penetration, but a strategic intent of the Communist Party of China, as well as the insider threat, the ability of the Communist Party of China to use a suite of tools to get what they want are really, really played out in these 2 particular indictments. And I believe that they are a must read for US businesses who want to participate, play, and or partner with some Chinese-based company.
So, right, so you bring up sort of corporate America and CEOs as being sort of integral to your efforts on this front. There obviously is still a pretty wide gulf between how the national security community views China and the business community views China. Just to cite a story from one of my colleagues, a couple of weeks ago, the former deputy FBI director had recently resigned from Airbnb due to concerns about just how much information that the company was sharing on their customers with Chinese authorities. And at one point when he spoke up about his concerns, according to my colleagues, a company co-founder told him, quote, "We're not here to promote American values." How important is this to you? How would you think about this sort of split between the way the US government views China and the way a lot of other people in America view China?
So I think it's really important. And I probably would not use the word split. I would probably use our continuing education of America of these pitfalls. And I don't know if there's a split or there's just not yet. We've accomplished what our goal is to be able to educate and inform CEOs and board of directors. And we've been at this for a couple of years now, and John's been part of it. I've worked in a bipartisan manner with Senator Burr, Rubio, and Senator Warner, briefing tens of thousands of CEOs and board of directors of the pitfalls, specifically with third-party data sharing agreements that China mandates you must do. Also, the American public is clearly not aware of all their data that's going free to the intelligence services of China because of business arrangements between a US business and a business out of China. Some of this, Aruna, is just education and awareness of the CEOs and the general counsels of the potential pitfalls. The case you bring up of that company, Airbnb, I think is a great example. And I think we have to have a conversation with ourselves as a society when we sign up for these companies and these programs and these apps, are we okay with our data going over to a communist country for utilization by the intelligence services? And do we even know that? And I think that's the conversation we're not there having yet, but we're trying on a daily basis. So I wouldn't say it's a split. I would say it's we're still in the process of educating and informing.
So John, to talk again about the broader China initiative, it seems like some of the actions the Justice Department has taken under this umbrella have been some of the things that most irritated Beijing over the past couple of years. You have the arrest of Huawei's CFO in Canada 2 years ago. You have the arrests of the military affiliated researchers. Do you see the Justice Department playing, has there been a shift in the role the Justice Department plays in foreign policy over the past couple of years? What role do you see the department playing? And is it sort of specific to China, or is there a more fundamental shift at play?
I don't know that there's a shift. I mean, fundamentally, our cases are the results of law enforcement actions and criminal investigations, like any of the cases that the department are. That said, of course, we have to recognize that sometimes our cases have foreign policy implications, either just out of necessity or because another country will perceive it to have some kind of impact on the relationship between the U.S. and that country. So we're aware of those implications for sure when we bring these cases, but really we're just starting from the point of view of where are we seeing illegal activity, and that really is how the China initiative got started, and just being briefed day in and day out on the intelligence side on what the Chinese were doing in the United States. And then, well, what tools do we have that we can bring to bear to combat that kind of activity? But ultimately, these are law enforcement investigations. So, they don't have a foreign policy purpose, even if they have, I think, they can certainly have and have had foreign policy implications. And that's something that, we need to coordinate within the government with our interagency partners, including especially the State Department.
And do you think we should expect to see any more developments this month and next month? Or at this point, are things kind of quieting down?
No, I think you'll continue to. I mean, we march forward. The malign activity marches forward, and we're not going to pause for a few months. And I don't think the incoming folks would want us to pause for a few months. The cases, there are cases that I think will come to a charging state naturally over the course of, the next 6 or 8 weeks, and we'll move forward on those matters. And there are other investigations that are getting started that other folks will finish off. I mean, when I started this job, the cases I was bringing were ones that had started, by John Carlin and Lisa Monaco and others. And, when I leave, I think the cases that they bring are the ones that are started now.
You mentioned the election, so maybe let's talk a little bit about that. Now that the dust has settled a little bit, Bill, if you can you talk a bit about what you view as how effective the U.S. was in deterring foreign interference this time around? It seems like it's been pretty quiet. I think we even heard yesterday at this conference that we were pretty successful on that front.
Yeah, sure. I'd actually be proud to talk about that, Aruna. I think from my perspective, what we accomplished the past 2 years, but specifically the last 6 to 9 months, as an integrated, holistic government effort in partnership with social media and tech firms is unprecedented. And I think it's really going to be the model of the future moving forward, how we protect not only just elections, but how we mitigate malign foreign influence and how we drive continued protection of democracy. I think our adversaries saw some significant loopholes in our democracy, and they kind of use our First Amendment and other amendments against us. So I think what we did the last 6 months to 9 months, both offensively and defensively, is going to be the playbook for which we defend in the future. I've been in this business a long time, going back prior to 9/11, and I saw this type of organizational symbiotic effort after 9/11. This is the first time I've seen it again, where we had, double-digit agencies working together every day, all day, dedicated women and men around the globe, collecting intelligence, driving action, providing real-time information to DHS and FBI, FBI and DHS taking the appropriate action, dealing with social media companies, taking stuff down, and then at the same time, doing really critical offensive measures around the globe, I think was outstanding. I'm really proud. I've said publicly, I think this would be the most important role I've had in my career. And I'm really proud of where we are right now and the success we've had. We did some really daring things the last couple months, both publicly and non-publicly. And I think they've all paid off.
Anything that you can tell us a little bit more about that have not been public yet?
I think it'll come public, but I also, my answer to you would be, I really want to give credit to the women and men of NSA, Cybercom, and CIA for the work around the globe.
So we did see one of the top officials involved in this effort, Chris Krebs, fired a couple of weeks ago. We did see the president's lawyer call for him to possibly be shot. Are you concerned that there are a lot of Americans that believe inaccurate conspiracy theories about what happened in this election?
Concern would be a word. I'm embarrassed would be a second word. I think it's wholly inappropriate and just disappointing to me as an American, the comments that were made that you referenced. I just, as a 32-year government official, it's just embarrassing to me that you would have someone who was respected once as a U.S. attorney or a judge make those foolish comments. It's embarrassing would be the right word. As my concern, yeah, because I think, our elections, as I've said this publicly, are the core fundamental basis for which we have the ability to live in amazing democracy. We have to preserve and protect our elections at all costs. So the folks who do that, who put their lives on the line every day, metaphorically on their line, should have the ability to do that with safety and security, not be anguished because one party lost, one party won.
And it does seem like China policy is one of the few areas of overlap between the Trump administration and the incoming Biden team. Just to quote what incoming National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had said on a podcast back in 2018, I would say there are certain areas where we should pause and say, is Trump onto something? He is much more willing to push hard in the way that the Chinese and the Russians both push hard on friends and foes alike to try to get a good outcome. I think that's a sensibility the next commander-in-chief should take up, combined with enlightened self-interest and an actual systematic decision-making process. John, what do you think changes after January 20th in the US-China relationship?
Well, I mean, I think from the department's perspective, probably not very much. As I said, ultimately, the department is looking at these matters as law enforcement matters, as individuals who've broken US laws. And, very clearly, I understood what I was doing to be building on work that had been done by my predecessors in the prior administration. Specifically, the cyber indictment back in 2014 of the PLA officers, which, required working through to your prior questions, a lot of foreign policy issues related to that indictment, but they brought it over the finish line. And I think that set a precedent that we were able to build on. So I suspect from our perspective that work will continue. I think the big question, if I were either staying here or coming here with the new folks is, what will the other agencies, what's their reaction going to be? My guess is whoever sits in my job, whoever sits in the AG's job is going to be pressing along the way that we have. But what has really enabled our success is we didn't get any pushback from the State Department. We didn't get pushback from Commerce. We didn't get pushback from USTR. In fact, we got, I think applause for what we were doing. So what will the folks of those agencies that have traditionally in both administrations tended to be more on the economic side of things and wanted to promote sort of the economic relationships between the countries, what will their take be? And there, I just don't have the insight into, who the folks will be and what their views are. But that's the big question that I'd be asking myself right now.
Hey, Aruna, can I amplify John's answer there? Because I think he's onto something. I think, as we work with our transition team here, and then I think two things will predicate where they go in a continuance of these efforts. Because, I would say the administration has done, I wouldn't give so much credit to the president here as much as one would want, but the administration's movement, as John talked about, that coalition of the willing in the administration of the agencies, but the evidence and the intelligence are going to matter. So the more, the evidence and intelligence we are deriving from Chinese intelligence services and Xi Jinping and their strategic intent and capability, that's not going away. So the fact that new administration comes in, they're going to now see that intelligence. President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris right now and the entire team are seeing the PDB. They're seeing that intelligence real time right now. So it's going to be an effort for them to continue down a path. May not be the exact similar path, but it's going to be really, really, really important for them to see this intelligence, this information. And to John's last point, those investigations that are being brought up and John is prosecuting, as the circle of life continues, more and more of those investigations are coming from businesses and academia to DOJ's way and FBI's way. That will continue in the new administration. And I think the new administration will be left with the ability to find a strategy or policy to continue to deal with this intelligence derivative and investigations.
Bill, have you seen any changes in behavior from China since the election, or are there sort of newer emerging issues that you think you didn't have to address as much that the new administration will have to?
Yeah, great question. So I think the last few months, parallel to the elections, we've been dealing really heavy on the COVID-19 front and China's efforts to thwart that, not only in the vaccine, but also in the promulgation of a supply chain and a movement of the vaccine all the way to inoculation. But we've also seen an uptick, which was planned, and we predicted that China would now re-vector their influence campaigns to the new administration. And when I say that, that malign foreign influence, that diplomatic influence plus or on steroids, we're starting to see that now play across the country to not only the folks that are in the new administration, but those who are around those folks in the new administration. So that's one area we're going to be very keen on, making sure the new administration understands that influence, what it looks like, what it tastes like, what it feels like when you see it.
And you saw more of that happening post-election?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. John, are there newer things that are on your radar now that you didn't see over the past couple of years that you think the next administration is going to have to deal with more?
I mean, I think it's a continuation of a lot of the same behavior. I mean, as Bill said, the intelligence is not going to change. The bureau is doing their work. They're unearthing a lot of this activity. They're going to bring those cases to the department. I think that's going to continue forward. I think, where we really need to stay vigilant on is on the foreign influence piece, and that's, election interference is a aspect of foreign influence that comes up every 2 or 4 years. And as Bill said, actually, the administration did a very nice job over the last years working together to deal with election interference. But the work on foreign influence continues. And on the broader issue of foreign influence, I think only the Chinese have the resources and the abilities and the will to do the breadth of foreign influence that we've seen here. And I don't think that that's been as exposed publicly as it probably will be over the coming years. Obviously, the Houston closure was a piece of trying to address that. But in terms of bringing cases and highlighting that, I think that'll be a fertile area. And to that, I mean, it's only the Chinese who we see operating not just at the national level, but understand our system well enough to operate at the state level through the state and local politicians as well. And they have the resources to be able to do that and the sophistication to do that. So I think that's going to be a big and a continued challenge. And I think our eyes were opened in 2016, but as our eyes were open, more and more of this activity from a variety of countries came into focus. And what we saw with Iran, for instance, on the election side, is some of these countries learning, unfortunately, from the misbehavior of others and trying to emulate it, even if not terribly well in that case. So I think that's going to be a continued issue. And on the China side, maybe a development of where this work has gone.
In terms of more foreign influence type cases, are you suggesting we might see more Foreign Agents Registration Act cases, or you're talking more broadly than something like that?
I mean, FARA is one of the tools. We also use 951, which is an aspect of the criminal code, which is also acting as an agent of foreign power here in the US. We've used that several times, both on the Chinese side and on the Russian side over the last few years. So using a variety of those tools, and then there's also the election finance and the campaign finance cases, which fall more in the criminal division, but we see that as an aspect of sort of, illegal foreign financing cases that can also be an aspect of foreign influence. So I think across the gamut of the cases, the tools that we have to address that kind of activity, you'll see more of that kind of those kinds of cases.
Got it. So both of you had brought up the international cooperation piece of this as being important. And it seems like the Trump administration has had some success in convincing other countries to not use Huawei gear in their telecom infrastructure. Looking out over the next year, 2-3 years, maybe Bill, this question is for you. What do you see the world sort of dividing up more into a section of the world that does use Chinese technology and telecom infrastructure, and a section of the world that relies on Western technology, or do you see this shaking out in some other way?
A great question. I think both of those. I mean, I look at this both geopolitically and economically. So there are going to be parts of the world and the globe where they can only go to China and Huawei because they're at 30 cents on the dollar, right? So we've seen China now pivot to South America and deep parts of South America because there's a prime market there. I think China now has realized that we've called them out, and there is now literally a geopolitical battle space with telecommunications and hardware and Huawei that they're battling. And they thought for sure they owned Europe. That's not the case anymore because of the collaborative cooperation at multiple parts of our government with multiple parts of European governments. And I think with the pushback with the EU, which we never thought we would see, has now occurred. So I think now what's the new battle space? Africa, South America, Indonesia, you're going to see China trying to continue to build that network where they have, called depth diplomacy, where they offer people critical infrastructure, AKA Huawei, for free with like a 99-year lease with, they're basically unable to pay it. I think you're starting to see more of that, and maybe in acquiescence where they'll play in the backyard fights in Europe, in parts of maybe Western Europe, Eastern Europe, where there's some fringe areas. But I think that geopolitical battle space will continue. I think the race will be, and you've heard this, is what's going to eventually be the United States' answer to Huawei. The quicker we get to a solution of a US-based answer, the quicker we're going to have more quivers in our arrows in our quiver to be able to fight back on what our answer is there. I think, but geopolitically, I have to give credit to all of us, not only in the U.S. government, international community, and U.S. business, to push back a little bit. And we're starting to see now a change in China's behavior on Huawei. And that also incorporates some of the indictments that DOJ and John have done, because it's all in the same bucket of information, intelligence, and facts, which really changes the behavior of the Communist Party of China.
John, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Well, it's going to be very difficult. It's, telecommunications is sort of the key. And obviously during these times of everybody working from home has become even more so the way we run our lives, which is why we focused on Huawei and on 5G technologies. I do think that we were able to change the conversation with Europe over time based on the evidence that we were able to show them. I also think that the Chinese changed the conversation by their actions in Hong Kong, by their actions with respect to the Uyghurs, by their now perhaps, whatever they're thinking of doing with respect to China. And so there's been a backlash on, and also really the way that the Chinese overplayed their hand with respect to COVID assistance. And I think there was a backlash in Europe and a realization, and this is, I think, going to define the relationship with China going forward, a realization that those of us in liberal democracies, in free market economies, just don't share the same values at the end of the day with the Chinese Communist Party, and that those differences in values have consequences for the people who live in those different countries. And I think the big challenge of the future in dealing with that difference in values will be China's economic power and China's willingness to use that economic power in order to push its policy interests. So when it comes to Huawei, the big challenge in some of these developing countries, but even in developed countries in Europe, is not, oh, Huawei is 50% cheaper than the alternative. not only might Huawei be 50% cheaper because of the government subsidies in China, but the Chinese government will change the level of foreign direct investment into your country. The Chinese government will change your company's access to the Chinese market based on your decisions to choose Huawei or not choose Huawei. And we've seen that happen in Europe, and we've seen it happen in other countries around the world. And that makes it very difficult for those countries to stand up despite the security risks that they're aware of. But despite that, I think, we've made significant progress, and I'm sure that the new folks will continue to push that.
So some of the Trump administration's other efforts to sort of counter Chinese technology have not been as successful. I'm thinking in particular of the TikTok ban that was not upheld in the courts, which said that the US government might have exceeded its authority on that front. At this point, it might be in TikTok's interest to wait for the Biden administration. But John, do you think that the Oracle deal will end up being completed under this administration, or what would your advice be to the next one on how to deal with TikTok?
So I think, TikTok and Chinese apps are really an interesting problem for us. I shouldn't comment specifically. There is that litigation's ongoing, and then there's still CFIUS reviews that are ongoing and efforts to move that forward. So I'm not going to comment specifically on what the solution space might be here. But the problem, what we know from our cases, again, and from the intelligence, is that Chinese have a huge appetite for people's personal data. And they satisfy that appetite through acquisitions, they satisfy it through thefts. If you think about Equifax, if you think about Anthem, if you think about the OPM hack. And then now they're able to satisfy it by people voluntarily giving their data to a app that is based in China. And it's really never about the app, and it's really never about the company in China. The fact is, if you do business there, you have to abide by what the government is going to ask you to do. So you might be in good faith acting as a Chinese businessman or a Chinese businesswoman, but that's really not what we're questioning. What we're questioning is your ability to act independently of the government and keep distance from the government. So I think one of the big challenges now, and the litigation has highlighted it, is how does the government deal from a national security perspective with apps and other instances where Americans and others are voluntarily turning over their data to China, and how do we protect those Americans from the exploitation of their data? I don't know that we've come to a clear answer on that, and I think that litigation and the various negotiations and the back and forth are reflecting that we still have work to do on that front, and that I think is something we're leaving for the next folks to work on. We wouldn't want them to be bored.
Of course. I know we are almost out of time, and before we ended, I did want to ask you about some of the criticism of the China initiative you have gotten from academics and others in the university research community that view this as a little bit of a racial profiling exercise, and sort of a lot of these are administrative or process crimes. I know that you've said all along the way that the Justice Department and the US government is focused on the actions of the Chinese government and not in Chinese individuals, and that some of the defendants have been not of Chinese descent. But in hindsight, are there things that you wish you had done differently about this? What about even just naming it the China Initiative? Are there things you would have wanted to do to kind of address this criticism?
I honestly, I don't think so. We knew that this was a concern, and we were very careful about the way we talk about this problem, because we don't want it to become about the Chinese people. We certainly don't want it to become about Chinese Americans here in the U.S. And as you know, if you look through our defendants, you'll see a great mix of defendants when it comes to ethnic backgrounds. We are very much focused on behavior, and when we talk to companies, I know Bill does the same. When you talk to companies, we talk about focusing on behavior and never on using ethnicity as a risk factor or something that those companies should be looking at. Same thing on the university front. Now, on the university front, I think the main criticism has been centered on the cases involving academics, really American academics, who didn't disclose foreign sources of funding on their US grant applications. And in some cases actively hid the fact that they were also working for the Chinese government or for institutions in China, and often getting funding for the same research that they were applying for funding for from the American government. I mean, to that, and yes, so the charges have been making false statements to the U.S. government and grant fraud. Are those administrative violations? I don't know. I mean, those go to the core of integrity at an academic institution. And an academic institution is all about disclosing sources of funding so that people who are reading your research can figure out how to read that research. And that's true regardless whether your funding is coming from the alcohol and beverage industry or whether your funding is coming from the Chinese government. The focus is on disclosure. And our cases there, I think, reflect a desire to tailor our approach to the values of those institutions, which are transparency and academic integrity. And those professors who haven't disclosed the sources of their funding when they've been applying for grants have violated what are really, university and academic values as much as US laws. So I think now there's a much greater awareness in the academic community of the importance of honest disclosures, but they knew that at the time. But also at the university level of having compliance programs that are adequately tailored to ensuring that your professors and you as a university are not making false representations to the US government. And our point here is, once you make those disclosures, let the US funding agencies, let your university decide what they're comfortable with you taking money or not. But if you don't disclose it, they can't decide that. And that's what we saw in case after case. And honestly, it's why the universities have been cooperative with us in case after case, because they know that they can't make that assessment if their professors and researchers aren't being honest with them.
I think we're just about out of time, but do either of you have closing thoughts you want to leave the audience with? Maybe Bill, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, again, Aruna, thanks for the opportunity to be here with John, and thanks to Aspen for allowing us the opportunity to be here together to talk about what John and I both believe I believe for sure, China is the existential threat that we face as a nation. John hit it on the head with their values are completely different than ours. And I think they continue to use theft by any means as part of the business process for the Communist Party of China. And we need to find a way to mitigate that, either through continued prosecutions and maybe more diplomacy, but we have to have an answer to it. That we're looking at $500 billion a year in lost economic investment, proprietary data, trade secrets, just the Communist Party of China. That's a lot of money. And I think we have to figure out how do we stem that tide. And also to John's point, we have to continue and have an enduring conversation with academia, research and development about this effort and those prosecutions, as you call them, administrative. They're being charged with non-compliance of administrative things. But the tail of that is, while they were doing that, there's a shadow lab somewhere in China that's building that same technology and selling on the global market for 30 cents on the dollar. So there is a long tail, both economically and geopolitically. So I think we have, as a country, have to have a more of a whole society approach to this effort and be more aggressive in advising and informing what is the consequence if we don't continue to have some equilibrium on the global stage.
And John, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Great. Well, thanks again, Aruna. Thanks, Bill, and thanks to all of you who are on the line and listening. I think, by the way, Bill, I think we've lost participants over the course of this. Is a very bad sign for you and me. But but look, for the participants, really, a lot of whom are from the private sector, as Bill and I have said in many occasions, we can't do this by ourselves. And really, ultimately, as a government, we're trying to help the private sectors and universities to play defense, to defend against these threats, to educate about these threats, so that they can continue to play offense, so that they can innovate. And what gives me hope in all of this is that technology is ultimately constantly innovating. And I do think, and I think the coronavirus vaccine is a great example of what can happen when American companies and other companies can put their minds to it. They can innovate very fast with government help in this case, but with the great focus that's been brought upon us by this tragedy. But that's the way we're going to get through this. So our job is to make the Chinese job harder, to slow them down, to cause them to force more resources. Our job is to educate, but ultimately all of that is with the goal that American companies in the private sector can continue to innovate as they help us play defense. So I hope that's a lot of what we've been working with the private sector on over the last several years, and I trust that will continue on in the future. And I'll be eagerly reading about all these issues, because I think once you get into this space and you realize how important it is, it's very hard for you to just forget about it and move on. So I look forward to reading your articles, Aruna.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today, and thanks to everyone